doing?
I'm doing all right. I'm in a new place. I'm in a new space in an office that is not set up, but I'm forced by the rain to come inside. So
Oh, poor you.
I
I live in
know,
Portland, remember?
I know. So I don't have a place that stays dry when it rains yet. So I'm in the corner of my office, hopefully close enough to the internet to do this. How are you doing?
I'm good. I see your walls are bare, which means they're full of possibilities in
That's
your new
right.
space.
But they're a blank canvas. Actually,
They're blank.
this wall's gonna get knocked down, actually.
Oh, okay. This is one thing. I remember I had a history teacher who was really good, and he had a quote that I always remembered and guided me through life. And he said, "One of the biggest myths in life is that there are people who are artists and there are people who are not artists. And life is an art, and every one of you has a creative canvas." And I was just like, "Whoa, that's like deep. That's
That's
deep."
what
And I've remembered that ever since. We don't always have the luxury of having our life be a canvas. Sometimes we have to go to work in a place we don't want to support our families and so forth. But it's a great gift when you get a life that you have a canvas upon which to work, and you can paint things in and rub things out and redo them. And that's like a great beauty of life. Even it has its good and its bad days, of course,
Mm.
but that's a good theme that runs through. And this is kind of an example of that. We were thinking of talking about the primitive reflexes today, and I was thinking, getting up, how strange life is, because it is like a creative canvas, but it's also like a river you jump in, and then in your inner tube, and then you float along. And I was remembering finishing my internship, and I was going to be a critical care researcher in the surgical ICU setting, basically. And I had an academic career going. And I took a course in Chinese medicine, and I started to float in a different current. So I never would have thought that I'd be sitting here with you talking about the brain's primitive reflexes, and also this weird thing where we're combining 2,000-year-old Chinese medicine texts and modern neurological research. And it's just like so interesting, the places life takes you. How do you feel about that?
Well, definitely. I mean, we were talking briefly before we started recording about life cycles and midlife, um, and how in midlife your life can change trajectories. And I think that perhaps I'm in the middle of that, or maybe coming towards the other side of that. So things have been a little bit chaotic and hard to get much perspective. But I actually feel like that's starting to happen. So yeah, it's very interesting to me that we're sat here with you and we're going to talk about neurology in the brain. And I think I've always wanted to learn about these things, but knew that I didn't want to go on that kind of more rigid path where you don't get to make your own art. And by learning a lot of the natural patterns of motion that you teach, you can you can bring creativity to anything you do without messing it up.
I think it's so hysterically funny that you think that you get to the other side of this and then life starts
Uh,
to make sense.
Okay. Well, what I suppose what I meant, and maybe actually that's a good thing to say in order to provoke fate. But I'm coming on the other side of a particularly turbulent few years of my life, and it does feel like, at least for now, as we transition, that there's like a little bit more of a calmness that could be permeating around here. I'll probably still be just as clueless as I was before.
I've learned translating old Chinese texts that whenever I feel like I've just got it about all figured out, it's a means I'm about to stumble into something that tells me I didn't understand anything I thought I did,
Mm.
or not.
I think at the moment I'm on firmer ground because I'm not coming from a place where I think I have it figured out. It's more that I
Okay,
can just
that's good.
breathe a bit easier. Yeah.
We're working with the first year students who just started now, and we're talking about living a questioning life, and how, what we want deeply in life is to live a good life. We don't necessarily need to figure out the meaning of life, all those things. If we have a good life, we're satisfied. And a good life has to do in large parts with how we move through the world. And so we talk about how questioning is a way of moving through the world that allows us to be in different ways. And this is one of the interesting ones. And it's so great when we talk about these connections between old ancient Chinese people and modern neurology type people. And so interested to have you here today. So excited to have you here today because you've been working on this for a while and you've had some good teachers helping you. And you're going to come teach at our practicum next month. And why is a class in classical Chinese medicine having you come in to teach about primitive reflexes?
Yeah, so the reason why is, and you've touched on this many times, and it's one of those ones that's good to repeat, is that when we're looking at uh, life in the universe or just people and health through an aging lens, we're looking at motion and movement, which includes development. And development is something that I would say, in my experience and in my reading, is something that the more kind of mechanistic view of life really struggles to understand, because machines don't develop, they don't metamorphize, they don't, through their experience, turn from one thing into another. And all life forms do, including humans. And so, because we're talking about, you know breath patterns and life motions, and this, we're just describing with some really helpful precision what is meant to happen early on, what doesn't necessarily go according to certain patterns, or the kind of predicted patterns, how we can assess that system, how we can intervene and treat that system. And I think one of the messages that I want people to hear is that this idea about primitive reflexes, which we will definitely very shortly get into what they are, but it's an area that is increasingly having attention, specifically around childhood neurodevelopmental issues. So, children who are struggling to focus or to self-regulate or to sleep or to whatever. So many kids now, maybe, well, most really, are struggling in their integration and neural development. And so, in that context, primitive reflex assessment or discussion is becoming more widespread, although they're not nearly widespread enough. But it's really presently, for the most part, completely left out of a discussion of adult health. And I would like to change that because it's very important for a
Yeah,
discussion of adult health, even if you don't have a diagnosis of some sort of neurodevelopmental issue. This is relevant to everybody with a brain. Because
right.
either it develops well the first time, or on the other side, as things sometimes break down, these primitive reflexes can reemerge. So let me first just say what they are, because I'd be if I were listening, I'd be like, "What are they?" Um, so when we're born, our and in utero, our brain is very immature. So this big human brain that everyone likes to talk about, there isn't too much of that there, but we have our brainstem, and our brainstem houses the areas for the really basic vital functions for being alive. So our heartbeat and our breathing, and our blood pressure, temperature regulation, things like that. So it's got these very, very basic things. And because when we're born and we're immature, we're not able to do like intentional movement yet, right? Like babies are just kind of floppy and like, they're not able to say like, I'm going to lift my arm now, right? But they still do need to be able to do certain movements in order to survive and to develop and grow. So they need to be able to, to breastfeed, which involves movement and motor patterns. They need to be able to alert a caregiver for help. They need to start to do certain motions, and certain motions involved in the birthing process. So these are all housed as reflexes that are called primitive reflexes.
Can, for those who don't know, why don't we just talk for a second about what a reflex is?
That-
Because we think we know,
yeah.
but yeah.
Yeah, sure. So a reflex is where you provide a certain type of stimulation, or there's a certain type of stimulation. So that could be stroking the cheek in the case of the rooting reflex, or that could be a loud sound, could be a stimulus, or kind of going underwater could be a stimulus. So anything could really be a stimulus. And a reflex is where the response in your system is automatic, and it's not coming from this higher advanced developed brain. It's coming from the brainstem, basically.
So some common ones, let's think of some, like when a cat, when you turn them upside down and you drop them and they right
Mm.
themselves, they're not thinking, that's a brainstem reflex of coordinated motion. Or the startle reflex when someone there's a loud sound and you contract your muscles and your heartbeat goes up.
Right, and so actually the startle reflex is a really good example of a reflex that can, a response that can mature, right? And actually, this is a good one to talk about for people to understand the difference between a reflex and a response. So the immature infantile baby startle reflex, it basically, so it could be from a sound, it could be from a light, it could be from a sudden change, something like that. Then the baby puts its limbs back and arches its back, and then takes an inhale, and then it kind of contracts again. And so this is that primitive reflex response. Now, an adult who has developed reasonably well and is not sick or chronically ill, let's say, for example, the door opens like over there. I wasn't expecting it out of the corner of my eye. If I am integrated in this higher area of my brain's working well, I can just kind of calmly look up, because based on the context, if someone's opening that door, it's most likely a friendly person, right? Where I am. I should be experiencing a high level of safety here. So if that door opens, I can just look up and decide if it's safe or not, or if there's a threat or not. But if I'm not in that really, well developed, balanced, regulated state, then when that door opens, I go like this. And so I show the infantile reflex.
And so this is so interesting because the startle reflex is such a great example because it has origins in the womb and how the brain develops, but then also people's experience can shape it because we know the startle reflex is really altered in trauma, for example. And that's one of the hallmarks of trauma, isn't it? That the startle reflex becomes hyperactive
Um, it could
or
be. No,
can be.
I'm not going to disagree with that, but it could be. And I would say that because, well, look, I mean, we're going to get into it. So I haven't really laid the foundations as clearly. I just want to make sure that people can follow along, but I also am always happy to jump around, right?
Oh, please, please.
Okay. So what I would say about that is that when this startle response, this infantile startle response, when that develops in the womb, that's the beginning of the sympathetic nervous system. But before that, we also have a more primitive stress response, and that's a withdrawal response. So before the sympathetic nervous system comes online, in the face of some sort of threat, we're simply moving away and shutting down. And that can very much also happen after trauma. And it's not always well recognized as a startle response. And it's very interesting. There's a real big, we've been taught that these responses and our sympathetic stress nervous system is so linear that people, including researchers and clinicians, have a real hard time understanding this, even when it's pointed out to them. That if you have someone who has trauma and someone hears like a car backfire, maybe they've been overseas fighting in wars. Well, one person might have a PTSD response where they fly off the handle and they go into a sympathetic, but someone else might go more into like the 10,000 yard stare. And it really, people need to understand that that is also a startle response and one that shows that they've devolved more, that they've gone down more down the ladder. They've become less developed, less evolved. Um,
So, and you might miss that trauma because you don't see all the kind of yelling and kind of screaming and heart rates and sweating and all that kind of stuff.
That's right. And if someone's a bit stuck in that mode, what happens is that when they go to a doctor, for example, everything looks really good because their blood pressure is
Right.
low and their heart rate is low and their lipids are low. So everything's nice and low and they get completely missed. So this is one reason why it's really helpful to create this awareness. So in terms of the primitive reflexes more generally, so the startle response is a good example as a survival reflex because it's going to help us take an inhalation. If we stop breathing, if we need to alert our caregivers for some help, there may be some ties to monkeys holding onto mom's back doing this. Um, but we've got a bunch of them. So I think in terms of how many primitive reflexes there may be something like in the 40s or something like that. But
So primitive reflexes versus other reflexes are ones that are at the brainstem level that form in the developing brain and are for early childhood survival mostly, or
Infantile
have
survival.
infantile. So I remember a lot of those. I was taught go away around 6 months or something, 6 to 12 months, something like that. So there are also pediatric milestones that they check and so forth.
Yeah, that's right. So, one again, an interesting thing to jump in there about like when should they
Go away.
yeah, when should they go away? Well, what does go away mean? And also the when question. So, in terms of go away, they get integrated. So because we develop like a tree, then as the brainstem drives the development of the higher levels of the brain through stimulation and movement and experience, then the brain comes down and regulates and it inhibits those from firing, but they're still there and they can still be used in our movements and in our experience as adults. So, as an example, if you start off as a very basic piano, basic piano lessons, you're just pressing keys. When you're like an expert concert pianist, you're taking those very tiny, simple movements, and then you're still pressing keys, but you're doing it in really complex, artful ways. So, you can use these primitive reflex movement patterns in more sophisticated movements. So they're still there, and they're also still there in case of an emergency, in case this stops working. Then then the brainstem is still there, keeping you alive. But in terms of the timing, this is a really, really important thing to understand. That first of all, you know, this industrial medicine or this reductionist medicine is not good at understanding development, so they've never really I don't know, decided what was healthy in terms of those reflexes integrating in any sort of really systematic way. So it's kind of arbitrary. And then we have this movement now, which is very well intentioned, to kind of sit like celebrate everything and accepting of everything, and everything goes, and like everyone's going to develop in their own time. So we've kind of thrown out norms as if they were always coming from judgment, but the truth is that there are specific timings for human mammals to integrate these things, and they go in a sequence and they go in an order. Most of them should be integrated by 4 months. Some of them a little bit later, and then the last one that's a primitive reflex called the Babinski reflex integrates at 12 months, and that's usually associated with the child being able to walk. So the Babinski reflex has to do with one that's on the bottom of the foot, and those are related to milestones because milestones tend to be they're either movement based or socially based, but
Right.
they're telling you about brain development. So we're looking at different windows into the same thing. But in terms of milestones as well, the research is pretty clear that it's a much narrower range than the kind of general pediatric societies tend to be taught. And what we have now in the United States, we have the Centers for Disease Control, and they publish these guidelines on milestones. And the new ones that came out basically just delayed them all in what I would call a race to the bottom. So they removed crawling as a milestone completely, and then I think they said they changed walking. I don't remember what they had it as before, but they put it back to like 2 years or something like that. 2 years is not the normal window for a healthy human mammal
It's
development.
like how we it's like how we lower menarche now because of
Right,
all the environmental issues.
right.
Yeah, and
So
say it's now it's normal to
exactly. So for babies, it should be between 11 and 13 months. And any earlier shows a problem, and any later shows a problem. And I've recently been asked that because people kind of know that I study this, and they ask questions. Well, I was an early walker, and I was always proud of it, and all this stuff. And I guess I would to that because people see it as like a badge of honor, like they're kind of ahead of schedule.
yeah.
But it's a little bit like if you had this beautiful flower that's supposed to bloom in May, but it bloomed in February, you wouldn't be like, "Wow, that flower is so fast." How great that it could figure that
Right.
out.
It's about timing.
It's about timing.
I remember in medical training, when we learned reflexes to assess children and infants and newborns, it was essentially to see if they had brain damage,
That's right.
to tell us right away, oh, there's something not right with this child. But I think what's been so interesting learning from you about this as we talk is the idea like, well, like a child could pass all their developmental steps and have trouble in their marriage when they're 50, because of a problem of developmental integration when they were in the womb or just born. Can you say more about? Is that a good time to talk about this?
Sure, I'm very happy
That's,
to.
I think that's really where this goes from esoteric neurology to kind of to like, oh, every day, like everybody, it's everywhere. You know, when you, one of those things when you start looking for it, it's like, oh my god, it's like plastics in the environment. It's
It's
everywhere.
everywhere.
You know.
It's everywhere. It's when you talk about like nature versus nurture in terms of health and how people are born with a wobble, that it's like those little tendencies, and it's not necessarily bad. It's just we all have these tendencies, and the way I really do imagine it is if I'm thinking about looking at a tree, and if we were to, and again, we're not trying to make everyone the same, and we're not trying to pathologize everything, but essentially when things go off course a little bit in utero or infancy, then when we take that over time, that ends up being a big off course. um, and so there's a couple things to help people navigate this. One is that and I haven't mentioned this yet because we were just talking about brain reflexes, is that the higher bits of the brain, well, actually, and the brainstem itself, to be fair, everything in the nervous system, just like everything in the body, has two sides. It has a left and a right. So we've got a midline and a left and a right. And this is particularly important for the nervous system. And so what what can happen, because again, I think a lot of people, I know I did, have this idea in their mind that if you're not talking about like a severely disabled or diagnosable kid, then why are we talking about it? But everybody has a left and right to their brain. And if um, and one of the main functions of each side of the brain is to inhibit the other side. And one of the main functions of the higher brain is to inhibit the lower brain. It's very interesting. We tend to think of it as being so all about like doing things and creating and adulting, but it's actually about balancing and about being able to get along in groups of people and fight your impulses and things like that. So what happens then is we get this developmental wobble where one side is developing faster than the natural timing would suggest is optimal. Then what tends to happen with that is the other side develops slower at the same time. And so the way you can imagine this is, if I think of it as like going through life with one arm, doing one armed push-ups, right? You end up with like a one really strong smoking award-winning bicep and the other side's a bit atrophied. And this can easily happen in our brain, which leads to having a combination of gifts and attributes that you're maybe particularly good at, and these strengths coupled with these weaknesses. And I would say it's probably, it's part of the normal, healthy human condition to have a combination of strengths and weaknesses. But when it gets blown out, it's just maybe a different way of going through the world. And these can start, it will do start in gestation often.
We see that in Chinese medicine all the time. When we look at deficiency and excess states, the one idea is that, well, there could be a global deficiency, like you're malnourished. That's one problem. But most of the time, when we're dealing with people, we're looking at like there's an empty spot here, there's too much here. It's called yoyu budzu in the Neijing. Like you have too many resources here, not enough here. And the health is always, and the prescription in the Neijing is always restore the proper circulation, which means, do you remember that treatment mantra?
Yeah.
Where like where it's empty, mend it and feed it, and where it's too much, irrigated circulation, and that's like the basic approach to treatment.
Mhm. So
So
this view into neurology, just it's exactly that, and it provides, I guess, like another map to overlay, I suppose, on the river system. And there's also a lot in common as well. So, for example, we could, I'm learning about what things are on the same, like what parts of the body are on the same side or governed by the same sides of the brain, or which are kind of going across. And I think that leads, when people get into like pop neurology and it gets a little oversimplified, and then they try to apply it to Chinese medicine, and it's a little bit confusing, but there's a lot of things, a lot of nuance in there that's really interesting and really helpful. So for,
that's, I wonder if it's the same when you're treating people too, because like in the thing based, car mechanic model of Western medicine, which is about it's about parts. It's always about where's the broken part. Like we look at the reflex, like is there a part of the brain that's broken? In early Chinese medicine, it's about the flow states and about irrigating things and about restoring ecological principles and balance. Does that have relevance here?
Absolutely. I I think it absolutely has relevance, and I think what it's mainly doing is overlaying a longer time horizon on it. And maybe, and I haven't, you have so much experience with practicing this that maybe this adds a level of complexity that you don't even need. But it's like, you can look at the person now and see where do they need irrigating, where is there too much, and you can bring it. Um, with this understanding, it's like if I'm able to do an exam and see that the person has a brainstem immaturity on one side, and that's leading to developmental issues in their prefrontal cortex, then in that model, the stimulation needs to happen over a longer period of time, and so it's about repeated feeding, and almost making up for lost time. So, we see this in studies if we're looking at brain activation in something like ADHD, which tends to be the left hemisphere is relatively overdeveloped or developing faster than peers, and the right side is less developed because the left side of the brain is about towards functions about and behaviors go from here to there, do goal seeking, and the right side is about stopping those and calming those down. So if you have, but because they're meant to be controlling each other, you have a case where the left hemisphere is being used more and the right hemisphere is not there to calm it down and stop it. So they're at different developmental ages. So it's like we're looking at a tree, and one side of it has the growth of let's say a 12-year-old tree, and the other side has a growth of like an 8-year-old tree. And if it's to do with some sort of like obstruction that you could remove, I can see how that could just change the resources for the tree. But if it's more of like a stimulation issue, metaphorically, where the more developed side of the tree was on the sunny side, and the other side of the tree was not getting enough light, not getting enough water, then we might need to kind of rotate it and give it like more time to balance out, you know?
Oh, there's so many interesting things you're touching on here. One of them, which we have to have a podcast about, is the importance of time in life and healing. It's the unspoken element which is behind so many healing interactions, and of which modern people are so lost these days about time. That different tissue planes have different time rhythms, that healing takes time, that some problems take longer time than others, that they have different tempos and rhythms. I'm also thinking of two other things we think about in the Neijing when you as you're talking, and one is the idea we talk about when we're working with the body in the clinic, we actually are working with multiple bodies. So we kind of have 10 of them right now, and one of them is the child body. And the idea of the child body is like you're not a child and then become an adult as two separate things. You're a child that ages essentially. So like these things, these patterns that stuck down, you can be working with them when the person's 70 and is still in their child, what we call the child body, it's still there. And the other thing is about the preparing the ground treatments, which is the idea that there are these list category of things that if you don't address them in the beginning or right up front, all your other treatments are limited or can be
Mm.
impaired.
Well,
And there's,
I'm
yeah.
curious if, because I don't want to add any categories that don't need to be added. So, but I'm curious if this is the infant body, which is a little bit different than how you describe the child body,
Ah.
or if it's part of the animal body. Um,
Right, and for those who don't know what's the animal body, it's your nonverbal felt sense body, how you move through the world by knowing how it feels to be in a body, kind of, or how would you say that, Mel? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I just tend to think of how I interact with my dog, and like
Yeah.
and how he responds differently to different people based on how they are with him and how safe he feels.
And they're following kind of a circulatory feel of like, I wanna go sit in that person's lap, I don't wanna sit in that person's lap, it's time to get up, I need to stretch, all those kinds of things. We also call it the purring,
Yeah.
and growling body too, a little bit like, "Roar."
So I'm thinking actually that this is a different body. This is an infantile body. Yeah, because, because, for example, when a kitten's born, essentially almost right away it can walk, and humans go through this protracted development where we're talking about something else. We're like it's like a bit of a stage of gestation outside of the womb. So if we talk about it from like 0 to 6 months, it's just a little bit. It's not it's not really like the child body, where the child body is like, oh, kind of about curiosity and innate interest. It's just before that. Um, it
Here you can also see, like, cultural cortical, prejudice in a certain way, or that there's a valuing about what the cortex does,
yes.
so it's like an adult is becoming a cortical person where you can inhibit things and you forget what it's like to play and roll around in the sand, and all the things that your animal body and your child body and your infantile body likes, and somehow becoming an adult is like editing all that.
Mm.
And then there's kind of a judgment, like, well, that's actually better. Do you sense that, or is
I
that?
absolutely sense that, and here's the thing, I mean, it's kind of, part of something that we see all over our culture in different contexts, but it's like valuing the fruits, but not really
Oh yeah,
understanding.
we just want to grab the fruits
Well, we
and
just
move
wanna
on to the
grab the
next
fruits
fruit.
and we don't understand where they come from, and, on my journey with this, it's been really interesting first understanding, that if you don't have a brainstem that's fully developed and mature and and as equal as it's meant to be, then you're not going to have super um, interesting thoughts. You're not going to write a book. You're gonna struggle with all this stuff. And the next piece, which we're jumping around a little bit, but there's another really important part of the brain, especially developmentally, called the cerebellum. And it's cerebellum just means little brain, and it comes off of the middle of the brainstem and it sits underneath. And most people don't realize this. It has about 70% of our neurons. It has like way more neurons in it than the cortex, right? The outer part. But the other thing is that if the cerebellum is not happy, just like if the brainstem's not happy, the cortex isn't going to develop and it's not going to work very well. And there's really interesting studies. There's this particular part, we like the outer bit. It's associated with adulting and the kind of the fruits and the payoff, and it's what makes humans so great. And there's a particular part that's meant to be the best part that's called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. That's like the creme, the pinnacle of human brain development achievement. It's like the most human awesome bit. Everyone, all the brain researchers love it. That won't work or develop if the cerebellum isn't working. um, and it's definitely a development thing, because if the cerebellum is not happy or developing well, then you can have issues with developing language, with developing writing, emotional regulation, all kinds of things. But if the cerebellum is damaged after it develops, those same problems don't arise.
This is an aside, but I can't help but thinking the way the cerebellum function has really changed in the last 15 to 20 years with screens.
Yeah.
Because, for several reasons. One is, like, now in radiology, that we have this thing where, like, oh, that's the cell phone response, where someone has their head over and they're kind of stuck in this position all day, and then the bone elongates off the back of their head right over the cerebellum area. But the other thing is that we sit in positions where we're, like, stuck in a certain visual
Yeah.
space and brain space and body space for hours on end now, which was not the case 20 years ago.
No, well, gosh, that could be oh gosh, that's so.
That's a I don't wanna, like, get
No,
us
I
derailed.
mean,
I just wanna throw
let's
that.
do it. Let's go.
Yeah.
Let's go where we go. Okay, so let's talk about cell phone use and the cerebellum, because because the cerebellum does a lot. It's when I started looking at it and I'm like, how am I just learning about this? So first of all, it's classically known to be involved in movement, in accuracy, balance, and coordination, the ABC. So accuracy of movement, of being able to move your body where you intend to. Balance, so if you're sat down on your cell phone and you're not walking as much, then you are letting that atrophy. And coordination, right? So we're kind of narrowing things to the midline. The second thing is you talk about posture. So the cerebellum is also responsible for the muscle tone on our backs, on our extensor tone. So when you would, there's a two-way thing going on here. That if you adopt this position and you're letting these muscles go relaxed, that's also causing the cerebellum to shrink because it's putting us
Oh,
into
yeah.
this position. And the third thing that came to mind is that the cerebellum controls our eye movements, right?
Which now it's stuck on a
Which is now
screen.
stuck on a screen. So, you know, what
Yeah.
we are meant to be doing, we're meant to be having a whole gorgeous, diverse buffet of visual stimulation. Go outside, you're looking far, you're looking near. And also one thing that's missing is relaxed peripheral awareness. That's really great for calming our nervous system. We're focused in the center. That's a different neurology when you're focused in the center versus allowing your periphery.
I'm thinking of those, maybe I mentioned this before, but those blue zone regions, where people live forever, and I say, what is going on there? Well, they eat good food, it's fresh, they have sunshine, they have water
Yep.
usually, right? The ocean a lot. And then the other thing is they're walking up and down these cobblestones all
Yep.
day, you know, to the market, back and forth. They don't not sitting in the car.
Oh, absolutely. I'm just I'm doing a pretty big deep dive on at the moment on the subject of perimenopause and menopause, and trying to tease out what's going on. There's a lot of contradictory things, but I'm looking at evidence for healthy aging and what that looks like. But the amount of movement that hunter gatherers and people in traditional cultures have after the age of 50 and 60 is orders of magnitude higher than it is in modern cultures. And that's one factor.
Given that, you know, it's easy to kind of denigrate screens, but given that they are part of our life now, do you have any suggestions?
Hmm.
'Cause they're not going away.
No, that's an interesting one. I think one thing I've been around in the healthcare and research space for long enough to try to avoid making oversimplified recommendations because I think those can actually be more harmful than people realize. So when you're trying to
Right.
solve any problem, you want to understand it well and make sure that you don't have blind spots. So there's going to be different user types and different people who are having different problems with their relationship with it. So I think the first thing is awareness of what it is like for you. Because I have certain stories about what's going on with technology, and it's correct for certain people, and it doesn't apply as well for others. One thing I can say is that the screen use really needs to be limited for children and adolescents.
Oh,
So
sure,
this
yeah.
that's a pretty easy one. I We've started a new kindergarten with our daughter, and one of her classmates' parents is a child psychologist in the public school systems here, and she said that the I can't remember what she called it. It had some sort of cute name, but the 5-year-olds are given screens to learn how to read on. I mean, that's a really sad experiment that
Yes.
parents are really struggling to be able to
And
opt out of.
and there's a way besides the looking at a fixed distance, all that stuff. There's a way that a screen with bright colored lights
Yeah.
flashing, interacts with your nervous system, which is not the way nature does.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of different threads to this conversation. There's one group um, that developed quite a few years ago. I think it's called the Institute for Humane Technology. I think it was founded by a Facebook whistleblower because there's this whole aspect to it where there is a large enough force of organizations, and people who run them who are trying to get people to be addicted to these screens. And, we're naive to leave that out of the conversation. Obviously, then there's well meaning teachers who want to provide tools that they think they're going to help their kids. That's a different category slightly. But we need to be aware when we talk about inhumane technology that it's programmed using methods that came straight out of casinos, and mere individuals are completely, it's not an even match. It's not fair. It's like if someone was doping something that you were having with cocaine that you didn't realize it, and you were trying to use willpower not to eat it. It's like it's not a fair match. So that definitely needs to be part of the conversation, that you need to understand that it's not simply a willpower issue. um, I am someone, I'm pragmatic. I use technology a lot, for my business and to help people and in my life. And so I see it as a tool. but really becoming more and more mindful of when I'm using it consciously versus unconsciously, creating
Right.
more time where I don't have any technology, so more, exhale time where it's not there. I can't remember the particular name of this, but there's this idea that because of the way the brain is plastic and malleable, every tool that you use regularly becomes part of your brain.
We have that quote in our class, take great care what you pay attention to. You become what you attend to.
You become what you attend to, and that could be true if I had, some sort of lovely image on my wall. But this is like because of like the way it's programming how I'm moving and stuff, and how my eyes are. It's like it's becoming an extension. I actually had an experience maybe a week ago where my phone turned itself off and it wouldn't turn itself on. And because I've just moved to a place that's quite like in the middle of the woods and it's a bit of a labyrinth, I was like, can I even leave my house and figure out how to get back? And I was going to take the dog for a hike. And I'm like, I don't know how to get anywhere. I don't know what time it is. And it was a little bit of a wake up call like, okay, I might need to find ways so that I'm not so helpless if this phone shuts off. Because then I could,
As it will
as
sometime.
it will sometime, and I could then shut it off. I could choose to shut it off more often.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean, it's a bigger discussion with this technology, but I think
Yeah.
you want to. The age thing is an easy one, easy strong recommend. Oh, sorry, easy strong
Right. Time
recommendation.
limiting. And it's also like, I think with technology, it's like, do you work for your technology or does it work for you essentially? Are you following it around and caring for
Yeah,
it and getting addicted to it? Or like you sit down with a list and say, like you say, technology is a tool.
yeah,
What are we going to use it for and so forth?
absolutely, and
Well, I found one thing I found that's actually seems neurologically helpful just is to take your screen and turn it on to monochrome.
yeah,
Try that because there's something about the colored flashing lights which is different than a gray screen.
yeah,
So in Apple, you can go into the accessibility settings and so forth, and you'll feel like, at least when I did that, I felt like a withdrawal feeling, like, oh my God, where are all the colored things? And then a week later, I was calmer.
yeah, absolutely. Mine is set like red shifted, so it's not monochrome. That's a lot to reduce the blue light exposure. It also makes it less like candy, there are an increasing number of like new devices that are coming out that are speaking to this more conscious market, so that you can get kind of fancy and not cheap dumb phones. And they're getting closer to something that I can actually buy. So, the first one that I saw, it was great. The idea is that it's just, it doesn't have so much on it, so you're not addicted to it. It wants you to use it less. The problem is that there are certain things that I and many people have come to rely on where we don't want to quite give up the phone. So an example of a newer one that's come out is like it's a dumb phone, but it does have a really good camera on it, for example. So people who are like, I just need my camera. So it has that. And it has directions on it and it has some music on it, so it's getting a lot closer to being like, you know what, I'm just not going to use it. Or they have it set up as well like, I have this during the week, but when I'm, weekend with the kids and all that, or whatever you're doing, you're off, then I have my dumb phone, so I'm still kind of reachable, and or I have these things I need, but I don't need the whole thing.
And it seems like this always follows an arc in humanity where we kind of rush to it and embrace it, and then it's like, oh, I'm getting fatigued by this. Then there's like a critical mass where people go, I'm this is ruining my life, or something, and we need to rethink it. Before we as we wrap up in our last part of our class, I also wanted to talk to you about ways that primitive reflexes can be treated, or if you have other topics
Oh,
too.
absolutely.
But I think people would be interested to know that.
Yeah. Okay. So, to flesh out a little bit about the primitive reflexes as well, so we mentioned a couple: the startle reflex, the rooting reflex. There's some where you turn your head and you get extension on, your arms and legs will move in a certain way. And so these can all be tested for using a very simple, non-invasive test. It takes less than 10 minutes. And again, we're just doing that stimulus response that they shouldn't be there. Um, Kind of a more conventional view, if they're assessing for primitive reflexes, it might be in the context of like a head injury. That then this is the brain's not doing as good of a job of inhibiting. It can be with like neurodegeneration. So if someone's older, then some of they're called frontal release signs. So these reflexes might reemerge. My thing is, they're all assuming that they were integrated in the first place, and I just don't think we should be assuming that. I think that plenty of people are walking around where they're retained. If people are in prolonged stress or they're chronically sick, then their body becomes less complex and they can reemerge. And these are things to test for. Um, so the exams are really simple, but there's just just ways that we can test for it. Now, the way to integrate them, there's a couple of key ideas. So one is that the way they integrate when we're infants is through stimulation. It's through using them. So if I am like, a little infant and I'm practicing like, oh, my hand's there, that's interesting. And then my head's turning and my shoulder's moving and then I'm starting to roll over. And so I'm stimulating this reflex and I do it enough. And that drives the development of the brain on top. And then I roll over and now I'm sitting up and I don't need that reflex anymore. And my postural reflexes come online. You talked about the cat's writing reflex. Humans have a writing reflex too, but if the primitive reflexes aren't integrated, it might not, and it might not work. And again, you might get this from your patient history. I had a patient an adult patient who kept falling on her face, and I'm like, why isn't she putting her hands out? Because she's retained primitive reflexes. She hasn't developed to be able to do that yet. Um,
Mhm.
and so the way we integrate them is to stimulate them. And so you can stimulate them basically the same way that you'd examine them. So as an example, with the Babinski reflex that we mentioned on the bottom of the foot, you test for that by stroking the bottom kind of between the little toe and the fourth toe. And if the foot goes back towards the nose, then that's the retained response. And so you can integrate it by doing that stimulation. Now, more people are aware of neuroplasticity where the brain can change itself, but it really does usually require a lot of repeated stimulus. It's not just like a one-time deal. So that sort of thing. If stimulating it's a bit awkward, they use that a lot with kids. But if you don't have like your primitive reflex stimulator person who's going to just do this for you a few times a day, then we can use exercises. So in the case of the Babinski reflex, for example, on the bottom of the foot, we could take a tennis ball and stimulate it by just rolling our foot on it and really pay attention to the textures. That we could be practicing and moving up to kind of really slow toe raises where we're really pushing through and focusing on that. So there's a series of exercises for each that help to integrate it. And uh, for what's been interesting to me is I kind of assume like this is sort of like a newly recognized way of looking at things, but I assume that people had sort of figured this out before, maybe didn't use this language. So I think there's a lot of cultural practices and movements that really do address some of this, different qigong practices or like animal movements for kids, things like that. The second component, and I should say, one of the key person that I studied this whole area with is Dr. Robert Malillo, who he's just earned his PhD. He works. He's written several books. He's published a lot of research. He's a really kind human and knows more about how the brain develops and works and what to do to help it than pretty much anyone on the planet. And so the other, he teaches that sometimes just stimulating the reflexes might not be sufficient. So one thing that needs to be addressed is if someone has this really uneven development between the two sides of their brain, then you also need to stimulate the underactive brain.
I'm glad you mentioned him in his work because I know he's been key in your understanding and learning. It's interesting too because get correct me if I'm wrong, but the primitive reflexes and other parts of the neural nervous system will set how the musculoskeletal body carries itself, right? So you have a primitive reflex, and then it actually embeds itself in your connective tissue body. And then you wait, fast forward 40 years, and you have these big kind of changes. And so I'm wondering also if working on the connective tissue body reverse helps the nervous system.
Uh, I would say yes, and it needs to be accompanied by a change in movement patterns. And I
So it's like a resetting the
Yeah,
code or
and
something.
I can see a case where in someone resetting the connective tissue is sufficient to get them to move differently. but in other cases, I can see where they would need to be a bit more intentional. I mean, like I can give you my own, like use myself as an example. I went to see Dr. Malillo as a patient. I had a lot of dysautonomias, I had chronic fatigue, I had autoimmunities, and by the way, a lot of people with those things have retained primitive reflexes, and that's again that's your brain stem. That's going to directly affect your heart rate. It's going to directly affect sympathetic and parasympathetic to an extent that just sitting and saying "om" isn't going to necessarily quite get to. And so, for example, I had one of the reflexes when I turned my neck, where getting this contraction of the shoulder. Now let's say I'm a middle aged patient that comes in and says, "I have chronic neck pain. Can you help me?" You know, if you work on that local area, I would get some benefit. I'd have perhaps reduced pain. I'd have perhaps improved range of motion, but it might not be enough to inhibit that pattern.
And we see that a lot, like people, "I got a massage, oh, it got a little better." Next week it's back, and we see that in aging medicine and in obstruction patterns too, like hidden obstruction pattern. They keep resetting the tensegrity. But I think also this neurological patterning is another level of that too.
Yeah,
Um,
and it interfaces with how we're using our body. So when we get good at something, doing it a certain way, we do it that way more. And so we're specializing certain muscles and sinews to do things in a certain way because they're easiest, even if that's not the most efficient way. So, with my neck, then if I release, if we release the sinews, that's unlikely to be enough to integrate the reflex. And so
right.
every time I turn my head, it's just going to happen again, and it's not under my conscious awareness. So if I'm driving or lifting groceries or playing or whatever I'm doing, the movement patterns are pathological, and I don't see a way where I couldn't have a neck issue. Like I would just have to. I'm because my only part of my nervous system is on a platform for standing upright and walking, and there's parts of my nervous system that are stuck in an infantile mode. This is not anymore, by the way. Mine are now integrated from the work that I've done, but this was at the time. But when you think about approaching that problem, like, okay, you've got a patient with dysautonomia and inflammation and neck issues and hip issues, whatever. I mean, another example, there's another reflex that's along either side of the spine called the spinal galant, and it has to do with what's called homolateral movement, same side movement, like a little bit like a crocodile or an alligator, right? And so when you stroke down, like kind of the paraspinals or just outside, you'll get this contraction to the side. Well, I will say that that is probably one of the most common undiagnosed causes of scoliosis. Uh, I would say that and vestibular imbalances. And a vestibular imbalance is where if my head is even like this and I'm getting the same information from my ears, which I should be because I'm still.
Right.
So both.
And that's when you lay people down on the table and you say, "Lay down straight," and they're like all crooked.
Yeah,
And then you straighten them out and they go, "I feel all crooked."
right, exactly, exactly. And so that's gonna be probably like that those 2 can go together, right? Most common
Mm,
reason that people develop scoliosis, and it's not discussed anywhere in the literature, but they're just their form is shifting based on where they sense gravity is, and they also have this contractile movement, um, that's causing the muscles to contract in a way that's outside of their control, and that happens over and over again, and then the spine changes.
wow, and I think one thing is right now, it's very simple in a way, and yet there's so few people. I mean, there's Dr. Malilo, you, some other people, I'm sure, but very few people talking about this, given the immensity of the issue. And that's going to be a real challenge for us because, like, all of this stuff you can kind of do online, except for the part where you have to test them.
You know what? Actually, so in the program that I run, I teach the exam so that their spouses or partners or friends can do it to them. I had one patient
Okay,
in Australia, and her husband, he's like an engineer. They did the exam, they recorded it. I was able to see, and they got very meaningful data from it. It's not rocket science. And whenever I do something, I always want to make sure that I'm ethical and safe and all of these things. And I'm like, is it okay that I'm teaching them this? But the truth is that if you go on YouTube, you can find plenty of people teaching it incorrectly. They're just not, they're teaching the wrong
yeah.
technique. It's bad. So I feel that it's appropriate if that's available, then it's appropriate for me, to teach people how to do this. And it's not, I wouldn't say it's the same as seeing someone who's been trained and experienced, like Dr. Malillo or someone like that. It's as you say, there aren't that many practitioners doing it, and even fewer who are doing it for adults.
Yeah. This is so interesting. The world seems to be falling apart at a rapid rate, and climate change, all that. And some reasons that I'm always optimistic. One is that we're using so few of our resources, and this is an example. And the other is that there's these big areas where we're not doing anything, and like that the world in healthcare can be so much better, and we don't even know those things are there. And when we find them, it's like, wow, we had no idea.
Totally. It's a
Yeah.
massive thing, and I guess, how would I contextualize it? It's not it's not a quick fix. It's not a pill that you take. And also, in some cases, let's say you have an adult who has these uh, retained and they integrate them. Some are going to feel noticeably better or function better, and others it's going to be more subtle and they'll still have work to do. Why? Because that's the root. That's the 0 to 4 months bit, right? And if that was
Right.
wonky, then how the eyes developed is off, how the vestibular system developed is off, how we stand up is off, postural reflexes and all of that. So there's often going to still be work to do. So it's the opposite of the quick fix because we're talking about development and slow time spans, but I work with people who are they've been trying to fix their health for years, if not decades, and they're already putting in the effort. So I'm like, well, now I can show you where to put your attention in the highest leverage areas because until your infantile reflexes are integrated, that's a first things first. That's a preparing the ground. And that's why it makes sense because it's not to say that it's a panacea, it's just to say that's the bit that develops first,
Right. How powerful is medicine when we start to integrate these different parts, the preparing the ground, the river flow, the breath integrity, the obstruction patterns, the story, all those kinds of things. Wow. Yeah. And it all goes back to that idea we said in the beginning, which is like, what do most people want as human beings is they want a good life, you know? And the good life means in many ways, how do I move through the world? And this is, set very early. And, problems of how we move through the world reverberate out into everything else we do. Yeah.
No, absolutely, and it's there's when I look back on my own life so far, there's bits of it that I find particularly kind of interesting to illustrate certain points. So, for example, one thing I mentioned that I had these retained reflexes, which in retrospect is just now obvious to me because I understand about it, and it's kind of runs strongly in my family and all of these things. But as an example, when you talk about movement patterns, I was very athletic and I competed at a pretty high level. So even though we talk about the cerebellum being important for accuracy and movement, and then having these weird movement patterns and my postural reflexes not really being there, I was still able to compensate well enough to compete in dance on a national level or to compete, in these different sports. But when I look back, it was just all these compensation patterns. So I was doing things very inefficiently, using muscles that I wouldn't have been using in those movements in order to make up for the fact that the other muscles weren't activating and all those things. And so now, if you could take this understanding, which we talk about this, but when you have an idea that is kind of just fundamentally mentally true, people just sense it. Like I don't really have to work very hard to convince people of this too much because it's kind of obvious when you explain it. So if you took someone who had as much training as I mean, now I think hopefully they're better about not overtraining children, but like, in the 80s gymnastics, I had this Belarusian man sitting
Oh,
on me,
girls soccer. Oh my God.
yeah, it was
What?
crazy. So the people seem to be a little bit better about that now. But the number of hours of training that I had from the age of 2 to 20, if that had been put into like integrating reflexes and using posture, and then coming from learning how to breathe, all of these things, what the kids would be, they would perform better, they'd be happier. But it's just coming from a different place.
And when you treat athletes as patients, oh my God, our dancers, their bodies are a mess,
Mm,
usually, often. Yeah,
yeah.
like that, as you're saying. Well, Mel, another hour has come and gone as we change the world for the better, hopefully, and stimulate ideas. Anything you want to say to wrap it up?
No, I just, as you know, I appreciate you asking me about this subject. Again, my key thing is that this gets brought into people's awareness, not just as like a child neurodevelopment, my kid won't sit still thing, but just how we understand ourselves and others. It impacts on every area of your life. And I guess I repeat just because of some of the stigma or some of the baggage that comes in this conversation. It's not about creating some narrow, oppressive view of normal and getting people not to be themselves and be more like this normal. Is more about helping people to be themselves. Right,
Right.
by helping them develop, and I've been saying since before I studied neurology, it's never too late to have a good childhood. So, if you need to catch up on your your infantile reflexes when you're older, then that's okay.
That's great. Well, I really enjoyed talking to you today, and I look forward to seeing you next time.
Awesome.